Hi, welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. Well, we are storming to 200 episodes. No, that's a lie. We've just gone past 100, but I'm excited. And that is a statement of intent that we will be heading to the 200 at some point. Listen, the episodes go on and on. The great guests go on. And in a world that is utterly bonkers and won't stand still, one of the things that I hear from so many senior leaders and CEOs especially is they fear becoming irrelevant. What is the antidote potentially to us becoming irrelevant? It's how can we innovate? And when we're not with each other in the pandemic, the pesky pandemic perhaps has made it more difficult, how do we actually still drive innovation in a hybrid world? I have so many questions around this that we have to talk to the innovation doctor. Yes, he really is a doctor, and there's a story to that as well. You do not want to miss this. Come back to me. We'll be talking to the wonderful Gautam Gulati. Don't miss this episode.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Hey, well, it is a massive warm welcome to Gautam Gulati, Dr.G from now on, for joining me on The Leadership Enigma. How are you, sir?
I am doing wonderful, Adam. Thanks for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to this episode. I say that about all the episodes because I really do. I love being curious. I love talking to smart people, and I love learning. And I hope that's the same for all the listeners as well. So I want you to tell us a little bit of a story because we're going to talk about innovation. But I introduced you at the start of the innovation doctor, but actually a doctor. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think I'm somewhat of a polymath doctor, which I think innovation is the primary focus of what I do. But I have my hands, for those who look at my background, I have my hands in quite a few things. But first and foremost, I'm a physician entrepreneur who builds companies and drives innovation with a focus on improving people's lived experiences. And so everything that I've done since my training in medicine, even if you talk about treating patients all the way to building companies and innovation, everything has been focused about improving the lives of people and how they live and make it healthier and a better sort of wellness environment for them.
Was that always the red thread for you then, for, as a doctor, improving people's lives through medicine, and then innovation as well, improving people's lives, but through innovation and being an entrepreneur? Was that the red thread?
Yeah. I think, my pathway and journey has been somewhat nonlinear, and I think a lot of it has just been accidental. And I think at the core of my interest has always been, if I'm presented with a challenge or I see a problem in the environment, it's just my natural tendency to try to find ways to solve and fix it. And, during my medical education, I also happened to get a degree in public health and also a business degree. And I think to some degree, practicing medicine should be done with a mindset of being ignorant, because the more you know about the health system, the more frustrating it can be to actually practice in the system. And I think that's ultimately what happened to me. And so when I veered off my pathway back in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of activity was happening in terms of a shifting healthcare environment. And where I saw lots of challenges, I also saw some opportunities. And given my background, I just gravitated towards trying to go and solve some of those problems. And that's kind of how I got into the arena of innovation and the world of innovation.
So have you always been insatiably curious? Because you're being very humble about this. I know that you were doing multiple learnings at the same time. Listen, I struggled just to do my law degree and law exams, one after the other after the other. You decided to just kind of lump them all together, as you say. As you were doing your medical qualifications, you were also studying, as you say, in relation to healthcare, and then the MBA. Where's that all coming from, that insatiable desire to gain knowledge? Or was it curiosity? What's going on?
Yeah, I think, at the core of anyone who drives innovation, you have to be a naturally curious individual, right? So for me, I'm just a sponge to the world. I like to listen. I like to get out there. I like to host events. I like to meet interesting people. And in fact, one of my mottos in life is actually what I say, go be do, which stands for go to interesting places, be with interesting people, and do interesting things. And that's kind of my North Star filter in terms of how I pursue different types of opportunities and activities. I mean, if it's not interesting enough or makes me curious enough, I don't go after it. And that's kind of how one door has opened and led to another door.
Well, I quite love that. I do love that, because I love that in relation to your path has led you to the leadership enigma. So let's focus a little bit on innovation, because I know that has been a focus for you. That's something that you work on passionately, that you've spoken to people about, you help people with as well. But tell us a little bit about where this spirit of innovation comes from for you.
Yeah, it's something that I think comes with some deliberate practice over the years, and in a variety of different roles in organizations across the spectrum. And I've taken on creative roles to management strategy, to financial, to management and everything in between. What I've noticed fundamentally is that oftentimes for innovation, people look to the left and to the right. They're looking at what best practices are and what everyone else has done. But in my actual practice of innovation, what I've noticed is that pursuing that path just makes you sort of in this endless cycle, in this game of competition. It doesn't really make you stand out and differentiate. And so we end up falling into the traps of tribalism. And so in many of the organizations that I've worked with, and either helping build out innovation divisions or running their own innovation divisions or building companies, I've often deployed many unconventional practices and techniques to actually differentiate products and services in the healthcare marketplace. And so, oftentimes that requires, taking an approach that oftentimes won't be well accepted by others. And so in doing so, we've actually had quite a bit of success. And so I took some of these practices, and when we sold the last company that I was with back in 2013, I started getting asked a lot to speak about innovation and to share some of these unconventional practices. And so in my sort of natural desire for curiosity, I like to sort of observe patterns in the world. And so I not only just took some of the things that was working for me personally in my innovation roles, but also studying the habits and techniques of other world-class innovators around the world and trying to figure out what's the common thread amongst all of them. And then how do I share that back with the world in terms of deploying some of these, I don't want to call them best practices, but these differentiated techniques.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you to share some of those in a moment. So in some ways, this episode, we can give some leaders some cheat codes in relation to what might be important to them. Now, when you were just explaining that, I was thinking to myself, it's the difference between the disruptor and the person who's willing to take a risk and the first follower. In some ways, I have many clients who have been the first followers. They want to make sure that someone else does it first. And was it kind of say, okay, we'll follow. But that's probably not good enough, is it? If you want to be at the kind of the tip of the arrow, you've got to be that person who's willing to take a risk, do something which is maybe left of field, untried, untested, has a modicum of risk attached to it. Well, that's you, isn't it? That's really what you were talking about. Now, how did you find that you were that person who was able to step into that? No, I'm going to do this first. I'm going to try this and accept the risk, maybe fail, learn, move forward, as opposed to, and let's be honest now, anyone within professional services, certainly within the medical field, you may have an aversion to risk as a doctor. So you might have been naturally the first follower. How come that wasn't you? How come you were the person who said, nah, let's do it this way?
For me, I think it's just, I've always been a black sheep, even inside my family. I've always looking at the intersections of different industries. So even within the world of healthcare, a lot of my inspiration comes at looking at the hospitality industry and how they deploy, for example, customer service and the things that we can put into practice in healthcare.
Yep.
Looking at, financial industry, looking at many of the other types of industries to see what we can pull in. So my just the way I think has sort of been non-traditional. I get bored very easily, for good or bad. And so for me, I think I've never really been a follower per se. I like to sort of think anew. And then of course, in the process of doing so, there's also a lot of mistakes. It comes a lot of mistakes, a lot of failures, which I certainly have. I have a portfolio of unsuccesses that I keep track of. So we only talk about successes in the world, but in order to get there, you have to have a number of failure and unsuccesses as well.
Well, I love that. And in a couple of weeks, I've actually got Gary Ridge coming off, who is the CEO and chairman of WD-40. We've all got a can of WD-40 at home, haven't we? And I didn't realize that WD-40 was because it was the 40th attempt that was the success. The other 39 were all failures. How good is that as a story?
Interesting.
So you have to.
Dyson vacuum should be like the Dyson 5720.
Exactly that. And people see the success, but actually they're not aware of the failure and the phoenix from the ashes approach. So we're going to come on to maybe.
I love that story. I'm going to have to use it.
Well, you're going to have to listen.
All of my techniques are grounded in story. So I love the fact that you share that.
I love everyone's story. That's why I do this podcast. Let me come back to one thing. You talked about trends, and a lot of leaders are very good at doing what they do, and they're internally focused, and they deliver high performance day to day. But one of the challenges is them to be outward looking, so that they're more outside in than inside out, to be aware of what's going on in the wider ecosystem. So tell me a little bit about how you approach understanding trends, identifying them, and leverage them for your own benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a whole set of techniques in terms of being able to recognize trends, and it all comes down to pattern recognition. Actually, one of my really good friends, Rohit Bhargava, has this wonderful definition of trends, which is unique in and of itself. He says, trends is, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's something, goes along something along these lines. Trends is the observation of the accelerated present. The observation of the accelerated present, meaning it's not about the fads and so forth, but if you see sort of patterns picking up steam and picking up momentum against those using them, then you can essentially potentially identify that as a trend down the road that may come about.
I like that.
Now, obviously, there's multiple factors that may interfere with that. But at the end of the day, for me, it's about looking at the commonalities from looking at disparate conversations. So there's this great poetry, for example, is I think they say it's the uncommon arrangement of common words. And so for me, in my mind, the way I think of innovation, it's equivalent to that definition. It's the uncommon arrangement of common ideas.
Oh, I like that.
And so if you recognize the patterns that are essentially being adopted in unique ways, and then understand what essentially is going to have momentum, that's ultimately where the intersection of trends occurs. And I think that takes practice. It's not an easy thing to pick up. I think it requires somebody to have the ability to be able to go between the clouds and the dirt and back and forth and sort of remove yourself from the trees to the forest and back to the trees. And not many people carve out the time to do that. And I think that's what puts me in a unique position, is I get paid to think that way. So for me to sort of be on the ground, drive innovation, but then back off and have, high level conversations, you can start to identify the patterns that go from cloud to dirt and dirt to cloud that ultimately get deployed. And that's my critical role. Like from innovation perspective, I don't look beyond 5 years.
Right.
I think that you're in the crystal ball witchcraft future business at that point, which I've never quite understood. I think there are techniques to be able to understand what's going to happen next year or within 3 years or even probability within 5 years.
And then that's really interesting, because a lot of people talk about the ability to horizon scan, horizon 1, 2, and 3, but what are the timeframes of that? And so that's interesting that you're saying really beyond 5 years, and we might as well get out our crystal ball. So I kind of like that as some advice. As leaders are listening to this episode, what advice would you give them in relation to them starting to become more aware of the external forces? Because everyone is busy trying to deliver, and there's crisis after crisis after crisis, and we're internally focused. And that's not a criticism, but it's an observation that many leaders are making of themselves. Best bit of advice to try and get them off the starting grid to suddenly become more aware of the wider picture. What would you say?
I think the key is to actively, challenge yourself in terms of falling into the trap of tribalism. I think it's really easy, especially in times like now, where there's a pandemic, there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace, not just here in the US, but also globally. Are we going to hit a recession? Inflation, I think, is taking place across the world. We have wars going on. We have, crazy policies happening that I think, naturally, as human beings, we gravitate towards the mean in times of trouble. And in times of uncertainty. And I think that's what's happening now, right? We find safety in numbers. And I think that for anybody, if they want to really externalize and understand, they have to sort of step out of this natural tendency of wanting to do and see and think like everyone else, and actually be very deliberate about, about not falling into that trap of tribalism, because that essentially just maintains status quo in my view. And so for me, if you look at the cross section of organizations and even the way investment structures work during times right now where there's a lot of uncertainty, people pull away and they tend to tighten up and say, let's just double down on our core and not ruffle feathers a little bit right now because we need to just sort of maintain status quo. When in fact, the real organizations that drive long-term innovation, they take these moments and they use that as opportunity to actually innovate. Because now is the time to actually take some of the risk while everyone else is sort of playing safe.
Right.
And that's when you come out of these times of uncertainty, that's what gives you that leapfrog advantage later on. And you see, even if you look at, somebody, I think Warren Buffett always says, be greedy when others are not. And I'm butchering I always butcher the quotes, but essentially in times
but I know what you mean.
Right. In times like this, he's doubling down, right?
Yeah.
He's taking advantage of these opportunities with investment opportunities while everyone else gets scared away. And I think organizations need to do that too. They just have certain individuals inside the organization that prevent them from wanting to make change or wanting to identify the trends, et cetera.
Yeah, those blockers. And so I love that. In relation to avoiding tribalism, we're really talking about trying to avoid that feeling of safety as well. I want us to talk about a real tangible example. I want you to tell you a little bit about the well home, because in many ways, and I know you have many projects going and fingers in many pies, but tell the listeners a little bit about the well home, because this is where you're blending a number of different skills and passions together in order to improve life, or in order to improve people's lives. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So this is a venture that we're sort of in beta right now, and we're getting ready to release it into the world. But I think this is a prime example of how innovation comes about and how trend analysis comes about, in terms of at least how I think about it. So just in short, for those listening, the Well Home is essentially provides interior wellness design for people living with chronic conditions. So it really sits at the intersection of interior design as it pertains to real estate, chronic condition management, and health tech. And so, true to what I do, I said I would never really jump back into new venture business, but I felt like this opportunity was sorely needed in the marketplace, because it really picks up where the health system leaves or sort of abandons you, right? And that's living inside our home, and how do we care for ourselves inside our home, where we spend most of our time.
Right.
And so you look at some of the trends, for example, that came out of the pandemic. If the pandemic only lasted a couple of weeks, we'd probably revert back to our old norms. But we have now fundamentally changed how we live and how we act and how we work. We spend more and more time in our home. We've now doubled down and focused on wellness. We've gotten more, just given the pandemic, we are sort of forced for self-care in that capacity. Mental health has always been a struggle now. We see multi-generations essentially starting to collide and live together under the same roof. We have younger Gen Z generations focused on their wellness. We have a baby boomer population that's aging and wants to age in place, focus on lifespan, on health span. We've got, a numerous amount of innovation that's occurred for digital health tech over the past couple of years. So we've seen 10 years span of innovation condensed into 2 years. So all of these are kind of like the tailwinds that basically suggest to me that we need to start providing and thinking about offering care for chronic conditions inside the home. And so there has been this great set of innovations around remote patient monitoring, where we're looking at existing conditions, using devices to track them in a clinical office, and then improving their chronic conditions that way. But much of this also stemmed from a personal experience. And this is probably the best way to share how the Well Home operates, how it differentiates itself from the marketplace. So a few years back, my father, who was a surgeon, got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And it was a rapidly progressive form, typically known as Lewy body dementia, which has a pretty significant effect in terms of your movement as well as your thought process and your cognition. And my parents ended up moving in with me, and I ended up becoming the primary caretaker. Now, I'm a physician, right? I think I know how to handle and treat patients, but when you're in the home, there are so many dynamics, especially in a condition like Alzheimer's and dementia, there's not that many treatments available. So there's only so much you can do from a clinical perspective. So much of it just comes down to how we live our lives to improve the quality of life and outcomes. And so I found myself every few months, faced with the challenge of having to redesign elements of my home or introduce certain products. Like, when do we move them to the main floor? When do we put grab bars in the shower so it prevents slip? When is he at risk for flight risk for leaving the house unknowingly? Or when is he at risk for slipping and falling? And are there devices that I can use to track that? How do we include him in conversations around the dinner table? So all of these things we're not taught or designed for. And that's ultimately, for example, what the Well Home was looking to accomplish.
And that's a lot about physical environment. That's a lot about awareness. And there's a lot about innovation there as well, isn't it? Because I assume you are in some ways trying to match what you're hearing and seeing from somebody's chronic condition to how can the physical environment around them make their lives better. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all driven. So ultimately, we're going to create a living lab structure that tries to understand how do we better track and optimize and measure health outcomes inside the home environment. And so there is going to be a lot of collaborative innovation involved with this structure, but you can start to see, at least the way I think about innovation, it's really this mashup of looking at multiple different industries, how the market dynamics are at play and how the intersection of those creates a unique market opportunity that fills a real need in the market.
And that's a great example, isn't it, of what you said earlier, of taking sometimes the common and putting them together in a very uncommon way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
it's no different, for example, from, if we just look at Uber as a prime example, right?
Yep.
Uber didn't invent anything new. All they did is they took existing technologies, they put them in a way that reinvented an experience that we're all accustomed to.
Yeah.
And so, there's multiple forms and ways of looking at innovation. But oftentimes, like I said before, it's the uncommon arrangement of common ideas. And that's exactly, I'm not inventing interior design. I'm not inventing management of chronic disease. I'm not inventing digital tech, but when you put them all together, it provides this service that has been, for the most part, overlooked in the healthcare industry.
And I think that it itself is a real gem that's going to come out of this episode. Now, I know that you're doing a lot with leaders as well. And when we spoke a few weeks ago, which was great fun, you also you had a way of describing 3 types of leaders. I'm chuckling because I remember when you described it to me, I said, you've got to mention that on the podcast. So just tell us those 3 categories of leaders.
Yeah, there's always people who try to resist forward progress, right? I call them sort of it's the quagmires of the status quo. And 2 out of these 3, I'm sure everybody will recognize. And the third one is somewhat a little bit unconventional, but you'll get it as soon as I describe it. And the 3 types of individuals and organizations that usually, try to prolong the status quo as much as possible, or resist change as much as possible, are the Chameleon, the Ostrich, and the Sea Squirt. And I'll explain all 3 of these very briefly.
People are listening now and say, did he just say Sea Squirt? Yes, Dr.G did. So take us through those 3.
And sure. So the chameleon, I think everyone's familiar with, right? So typical to what a chameleon does, they just try to blend in the environment and try to act as if they don't really exist. Go to somebody else. I'm just going to, disappear and become invisible in my environment, right? Yeah. So pretend like it didn't happen. Then the second one is the ostrich. And the ostrich essentially is known for putting their head in the sand, right? So they're aware of what's going on, but they just think that if they just avoid the situation or avoid the problem that's at hand, that it'll just go away and it's somebody else's problem. We all know that type of individual as well. But the third one, the sea squirt, this is an interesting sea creature where its entire mission and goal in life is simply to find a shell to which it can live in. And then once it finds that shell, its job is done. And so literally it eats its own brain because the job is done. And I talk about leaders and organizations as sea squirts because people tend to be very rigid in terms of their strategies. And you can't really drive an innovative culture, an innovative organization, if you basically put a plan in place and say, we're not moving from this plan, we're not budging from it, that's it, our job is done. But the world doesn't operate that way, right? So who knows? Next month, there could be a completely different pandemic. And if we run off of the same playbook as we have now, then it's completely renders itself useless, and you're going to become extinct in doing so, right? So we all know Sea Squirts in our organizations as well. So don't try not to become one of those.
I love those. I love that. We had to talk about that. We had to have this in that episode. So just help leaders who are thinking about leading themselves, their teams, their organizations in a post-pandemic environment. I say that as if there's not going to be something else, because there is already something else. You know, we are now having a cost of living crisis. We've got wars raging around the world, and then there'll be something else and something else and something else. What would be your best 2 or 3 tips to get leaders started in trying to get innovation as part of the DNA for their business, whether they're a very small business, a medium-sized business, or a global monolithic business? How can they start the process?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a number of different ways, but I think the first thing is recognizing the fact that just talking about an innovation agenda doesn't solve for the problem. And I think the biggest challenge we have in innovation is not necessarily our ability to innovate. It's creating a culture that allows individuals and organizations. I mean, it's not a single person job. It's not a department. It's an entire organizational
Team
job
sport.
To understand how to move product and services and advance them going forward. And I think that is a thought process. And so there's a couple of tools that I could certainly share across. One of them is, and they're going to seem so simple, but they're profound, because a lot of people actually don't put these things in practice. And there's really a story to a lot of this stuff. And I'll share a couple, I'll put them in context with some stories here.
Okay.
But one of them is we need to live in their reality. Okay. And so what do I mean by living in their reality? So we, as somebody who's gone through business school, it's hounded in us that every single time you need to create products that solve problems, right? That's it. We've heard that over and over. Figure out the problem, solve the product, boom, innovation. That's not entirely true. It's only a part of the solution. What I mean by that is you can't, create products for problems without thinking about the experiences designed for people, right? And so as somebody who's built products and does user experience design and so forth, one of the examples I like to share is electronic health records, just giving in context of healthcare.
Yes.
Electronic health records back in the early 90s, I bet some technologists went to a bunch of doctors and said, listen, if I could organize and archive all of your patients' information so that at the click of a button, you can retrieve whatever you want, would that be useful to you versus sifting through all these charts and in these shelves?
Right.
And so what do you think every doctor said? Absolutely, that would be fantastic. So they go off, raise millions of dollars, and come back and they say, here it is, doc. We've got this incredible technology that does exactly what we explain to do. But it wasn't built in a way that the experience of the way physicians treat patients. And so for the next 20 years, even though it was a great technology, nobody used it. And so it wasn't designed for the experience of how physicians actually treat patients. In fact, it was creating more friction in the environment and more work and duplicating work.
Right.
And so I think we commonly need to think about living in their reality and understanding that it's not just about solving for problems, but also about solving for experiences.
Gotcha.
So that's one thing. Yeah. You tell me. I have a couple of others if you want me to share some more.
I do, because this is really the golden nuggets, isn't it? As people are listening to this, I'm hoping almost making a little checklist, and this is how we start the journey. This is how we start the momentum. Yeah. So another one, please.
Yeah, another one is create small acts of meaning, right? We oftentimes think innovation is about go big or go home. We have to do something massive, something game changing. But oftentimes the smallest of changes can make the biggest of differences. And so there's this great study, I think it's by Dan Ariely, who wrote Predictably Irrational.
Yeah,
talks about this.
Dan Ariely.
The concept of the IKEA effect. Right. How that simple. What IKEA has figured out, for example, is they did a study where they had them build a set of furniture, and then they gave them a piece of like a 3,000, or they paid for a 3,000 piece of furniture, and they said, if I were to, which one do you want to keep if we have to take one away?
Right.
And almost universally, everyone kept the one that they had their hands on building with, because it had a small act of meaning to them, and that's sort of the magic that IKEA has figured out. And I get a lot of heat for this next example, but I often think that Starbucks has also figured this out. Like, why are there so many people attracted to Starbucks and their coffee? Because if you actually did a cross-sectional study, at least of the United States, I don't know about globally, most people in the United States like their coffee, weak and milky. And yet, if you've ever tried Starbucks coffee, it's super bitter, right? I mean, it's like it's almost like undrinkable in its pure form. And so what do you do with it? You cover it up. Add some soy milk, almond milk with some whipped cream and a cherry on top and some sprinkles, etc. So everyone creates their own personalized version of their Starbucks drinks. And I think Starbucks get that, because if you make that small act of meaning, you create loyalty.
Right.
You create people, it creates word of mouth. People want to talk about it because they feel like they're being. So that's another great example where small acts can make big differences.
No, I love that. Have we got another one? Can we do another one?
Sure.
Let's do a third one. I like threes.
We'll do, sure. So another one that I like, and this is more about leadership qualities. There's this great study done by Margaret Heffernan where she studies chickens as it relates to leadership. And I call this sort of concept beware of the super chickens, and I'll explain what that means. So what she's done is she wanted to study productivity when it comes to leadership at the helm of organizations. And so the easiest way to study productivity is looking at a group of chickens, right? So productivity is measured by the number of eggs that you produce. So she basically took a group of chickens and split them into two groups. One was the high performing, high egg producing group, and she called that group the super chickens. The second group was sort of the rest, right? All of the rest combined, right?
Right.
And then she tracked them over time. And what she learned was that, contrary to what we would typically think, that the high performers will actually deliver higher end products down the road and be more productive. The group that ended up being more productive was not the super chicken group. It wasn't the original high performing group. It was the diverse group of all of the others. And the reason being is because the super chickens literally pecked each other to death. They're in such a competition to hold their ground as being the expert, and I'm the best and I'm the most, that they forget what is actually truly required from a leadership and innovation perspective. And so I think having diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, and getting out of our silos, not only just within the organization across divisions, but also across industry, will actually create better innovation down the road and create a better leadership culture.
So how can people get hold of you, get in touch, learn more, continue the conversation? What's the best way?
Yeah, I mean, the best way, I think I have a speaker website, which actually has a lot of other information on there as well. Okay. But if you go to iamdrg.com, that's iamdrg.com, you can basically get access to a lot of my other information. Or if you're interested in the Well Home, you can go to thewellhome.co. Yep. I'm also available on LinkedIn pretty openly, on Twitter at Dr. Gautam Gulati.
Which is absolutely great. Now, I know, am I right in thinking there's a book coming as well?
There is. It's been a book that's been in the works for quite some time, but we have, it's called Deliberate Creativity. And it really, some of the things that we talked about in terms of my innovation practices, a lot of that is actually pulled into some of the techniques that I offer up in the book. But really, it's challenging this notion that you probably hear all the time, that there's no such thing as a bad idea. And I'm calling BS to that a little bit. I do think bad ideas do exist.
Right.
But the good news is, in my view, bad ideas are simply underdeveloped good ideas. And so what this book gives you is sort of the blueprint and the framework to allow you to ensure that you're executing on good ideas.
Gotcha. Now, here's an unfair question as well, because I think this episode has already been rich in great advice. What's the best piece of leadership advice that you've ever given or received that's kind of front of mind for you?
Oh, wow. Best piece of leadership advice.
Yeah. Given or received?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I sort of learned the hard way is oftentimes we externalize what innovations can do for others, but sometimes looking for the best solution is understanding how it solves your own problem. And I think a lot of great insights are often either missed or overlooked because we tend to say, and we talk about creating personas, right? You probably hear the word persona. Yes. You think of your customer, developer persona. Yeah. Well, why not use yourself as a persona? Because there's no better customer. If the product is going to help you potentially, then there's no better customer than yourself. And so to use yourself as a form of driving insights, oftentimes will give you ideas that you may not have conceived by looking at the outside markets. Because when you look at the outside market, it's oftentimes just guesswork, right? And then you got to go test it and so forth and prove either right or wrong. Whereas with yourself, you know what's going to work and not work. And now it's not, you can't use that universally across all things because there are certain things that you personally may not use. But I feel like that's a good heuristic in terms of ensuring that you're designing for the experience of the end user.
Do you know, that's a really interesting point, because I've had some recent conversations with leaders who forget that they're actually the customers of their own products, or they were customers in the first place. So why does that happen? Why do you think that people move into senior roles and then actually forget they were ever a customer, or indeed still are a customer for the very products and services that they provide? But that happens all the time, but it's weird.
It really is weird. I feel it's probably just a human psychology thing. I think when we just enter business, we go into business mode and we forget that business at the end of the day is a human interaction service, right? That's what we're doing. And we forget about that. We get so wrapped up into the practices and the techniques and what is this going to do? But at the end of the day, it's about a human serving another human, whether it be in the form of a product or a service. And we tend to forget that because we get so wrapped up in metrics and what we should be doing and what the markets are telling us and what everyone else is doing. And if we just step away and remember fundamentally, at the end of the day, leadership and running businesses is just about serving people, then I think we'll be in a better place when it comes to managing other people as well as driving innovation.
Well, there's another wonderful piece of leadership advice, I think, there that we've slotted in towards the end of this episode. Listen, Dr. G, you've been an absolute star. I hope you've had fun. I know we've had a short conversation, but I hope a conversation that has whet people's appetite. I hope they'll get in touch. And this has started, if nothing else, leaders thinking about how they can start to drive a culture of innovation within their organizations. Hope you've had fun.
I had a great time. I enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, Adam.
Many thanks again.